There are whispers in the darkness between stars, carried on solar winds that have blown for 10,000 years. They speak of Terra, that golden throne world where humanity's God-Emperor sits in eternal vigil. But these whispers do not sing of glory or salvation. They murmur of the countless souls that have walked through those sacred halls, never to emerge again. They tell of a hunger that devours not flesh, but the very essence of being itself. You see, the Imperium teaches us that to serve the Emperor is the highest honor, that sacrifice in his name grants eternal glory. The priests preach of martyrdom as transcendence, of death as a doorway to paradise at his golden side. But the whispers know better. They know that some sacrifices are not gateways to heaven, but fuel for a machinery so vast and terrible that mortal minds cannot comprehend its scope. They know that beneath Terra's gilded spires lies an appetite that has fed on human souls for millennia, growing ever hungrier with each passing day. Tonight I shall tell you of one such soul, not a hero whose name echoes through history, not a saint whose deeds inspire generations, but one of the forgotten millions whose essence was consumed in silence. Their story begins not with fanfare or ceremony, but with a simple selection, a moment when an ordinary life became fodder for an extraordinary darkness. The great processing halls of Terra stretch beyond the horizon, vast enough to swallow entire cities. Here, beneath vaulted ceilings that disappear into shadow, humanity flows like a river of flesh and faith. The chosen ones arrive in their millions, pilgrims, volunteers, the divinely selected, all walking the same inexorable path toward their glorious end. The air hangs thick with incense and the musky scent of unwashed bodies pressed too close together, a perfume of devotion that masks something far more primal underneath. Among this ocean of the faithful walked one whose name has been erased from all records, whose face has been forgotten by time itself. Let us call them the Chosen, for that is what they believed themselves to be in those final days. The Chosen had traveled from the rim worlds, from a place where stars were distant and hope was measured in harvests survived. They had answered the call that comes to so few, the summons to serve the Emperor directly, to become part of something greater than any single mortal life. The journey to Terra had taken months, packed into the belly of a transport ship with thousands of others. They had shared stories, hopes, fears. Some spoke of the honor that awaited them. Others whispered prayers in languages so old their meanings had been lost. But as Terra's golden surface grew larger in the viewports, as the massive orbital stations loomed like metal moons, something changed in the air. The excitement began to taste of ash. The prayers became desperate rather than joyful. Now, walking through these impossibly vast corridors, the Chosen felt the weight of 10 billion souls pressing down from above. Terra's hive cities rose in tiers beyond counting, each level supporting countless billions more, all sustained by the sacrifice of those who walked these lower halls. The irony was not lost. To serve the Emperor, one must descend. To reach the light, one must first embrace the darkness that pools in Terra's deepest foundations.
The procession moved with mechanical precision, guided by silent servitors whose human origins had been subsumed by sacred machinery. Their augmetic limbs moved in perfect synchronization, herding the faithful like cattle towards slaughter, though none dared voice such blasphemous thoughts aloud. The Chosen tried to catch the eyes of their fellow pilgrims, seeking some shared understanding, some confirmation realization that they were not alone in their growing unease. But most stared straight ahead, lost in prayer or meditation, their faces already acquiring the hollow look of those who had begun to surrender their humanity. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time seemed to lose meaning in these windowless depths. The Chosen's feet began to bleed through thin pilgrim sandals, but they dared not stop. The procession was a living thing that brooked no pause, no moment of weakness. Those who faltered were gathered up by the servitors and carried along, their unconscious forms adding to the grotesque efficiency of the march. It was then that doubt began to gnaw at the edges of faith. The Chosen had been taught that service to the Emperor was transformation, that to give one's life in his name was to become something greater than human. But looking around at the endless faces, at the mechanical precision of their handling, the process began to feel less like elevation and more like processing. The words stuck in their mind like a splinter. Processing, as if they were raw materials being prepared for consumption. The corridors began to slope downward more sharply, and the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Ancient stonework replaced the polished marble of the upper levels. Massive blocks fitted together with such precision that not even a blade could slide between them. Here were carvings older than the Imperium itself, faces of saints and sinners worn smooth by millennia, their expressions caught forever in attitudes of ecstasy and agony that seemed increasingly indistinguishable from one another. The Chosen found themselves thinking of home, not with nostalgia, but with a sharp, desperate longing that caught them by surprise. They remembered the simple chapel where they had first heard the Emperor's call, remembered the priest's voice trembling with joy as he delivered the sacred summons. That priest had wept with happiness, blessing the Chosen's name and promising that they would sit at the Emperor's right hand for eternity. But now, in these depths, where the walls seemed to press closer with each step, eternity felt less like paradise and more like an endless, hollow echo. The faithful around them had begun to change. Where once there had been whispered conversations, now there was only silence, broken by the shuffle of feet and the occasional sob quickly stifled. The servitors moved among them more frequently, their mechanical eyes scanning for signs of doubt or rebellion. The Chosen noticed that some of their companions were no longer in the procession, whether they had been taken away or had simply vanished into the shadows between columns, no one could say. Sleep came fitfully when the procession paused for brief rest periods in vast antechambers lined with stone benches. The Chosen would close their eyes and dream of their homeworld sky, of stars that seemed close enough to touch, but always they would wake to the same oppressive darkness, the same endless march deeper into Terra's heart.
And with each waking, the memory of sky seemed a little more distant, a little less real than the stone walls that had become their entire world. The priests began to appear more frequently as they descended, their voices raised in hymns that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. These were not the joyful songs of worship the Chosen remembered from their childhood, but something deeper and more primal, chants that spoke of hunger and feeding, of necessary sacrifice and glorious consumption. The words were in High Gothic, but their meaning felt carved directly into the soul. Feed the light, fuel the flame, be consumed and become eternal. But what disturbed the Chosen most was not the words themselves, but the way they made the faithful respond. All around, faces began to slacken, eyes to glaze over, as if the hymns were not just songs, but some form of gentle poison seeping into their minds. The Chosen felt the pull themselves, a warm, numbing sensation that promised to wash away all doubt, all fear, all sense of individual self. It would have been so easy to let go, to sink into that collective trance and simply follow wherever the procession led. Instead, they bit down hard on their tongue until the taste of blood shocked them back to full awareness. The pain was grounding, real in a way that nothing else had been for what felt like lifetimes. It reminded them that they still existed as more than just another face in the crowd, that their thoughts were still their own. But even as they fought against the hymnal influence, the Chosen could feel their resistance wearing
wearing thin like a blade against stone. The architecture around them had become something beyond human scale. Columns rose into darkness so complete that their tops might as well have been in another world entirely. Arches spanned distances that would have encompassed entire city blocks, their surfaces carved with reliefs that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. The faces in the stone were no longer recognizably human, elongated, twisted into expressions of rapture so intense they bordered on insanity. And always the descent continued. The Chosen's legs ached with a pain that had transcended physical discomfort and become something approaching spiritual exhaustion. Their feet, cut and bleeding, left small dark stains on stones that had drunk the blood of countless millions before them. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing down like water at crushing depths, making each breath a conscious effort. It was in one of the rest periods, huddled on a stone bench worn smooth by countless bodies, that the Chosen first heard the screaming. It came from somewhere far below, echoing up through shafts and ventilation systems, like the cries of the damned rising from some classical hell. But these were not the screams of torment, or at least not torment alone. There was something else woven through the sound, something that made the Chosen soul recoil even as their body leaned forward to hear better. It was the sound of something being torn away, of essence being severed from its vessel with surgical precision. The other pilgrims seemed not to hear it, or perhaps they had trained themselves not to. Their faces remained placid, lost in whatever dreams the hymns had gifted them. But the Chosen heard every note, every harmonic of anguish that rose from the depths like smoke from some unholy fire, and with each scream that faded into silence, they felt something inside themselves grow smaller and more fragile. The procession resumed its march, but now the Chosen walked with a new understanding. They were not ascending to glory, they were descending to become fuel. Each step took them closer to whatever machinery waited in the depths, whatever process turned human souls into the psychic energy that kept their God Emperor alive on his golden throne. The realization should have been liberating, should have given them the courage to flee or fight, or at least protest their fate. Instead, it only made them feel more trapped than ever, because even knowing what awaited them, even understanding that they were walking toward obliteration rather than salvation, the Chosen could not make themselves turn back. The hymns had done their work too well, the indoctrination too complete. Their body continued to walk, even as their mind screamed in protest, their feet following the path even as their soul begged for escape. The walls around them began to change again, stone giving way to something that looked almost organic, ribbed and curved like the inside of some vast creature. The torches were replaced by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting everything in a sickly green radiance that made flesh look diseased and shadows appear to move with independent life. Here, finally, they encountered the attendants. These had once been human, that much was clear from their basic shape and size, but whatever humanity they had possessed had been carved away as thoroughly as flesh from bone. Their faces were masks of polished metal, featureless save for dark lenses where eyes should be. Their bodies moved with mechanical precision beneath robes that rustled with the sound of dried leaves or shed skin. The attendants did not speak, but somehow the faithful understood their gestures. Groups were separated from the main procession, led away down branching corridors that curved out of sight. The Chosen watched in growing horror as families were split apart, as lovers were torn from each other's arms without so much as a word of explanation or farewell. Those who were taken away went without protest, their faces still locked in that terrible serenity the hymns had granted them. When the cold metal fingers finally closed around the Chosen's arm, they felt a shock of contact that was both physical and psychic. The attendant's touch carried with it an impression of vast emptiness, of consciousness stretched so thin across so many tasks that individual identity had become meaningless. This creature had once been human, had once had a name and hopes and fears. Now it was simply function, purpose, a tool shaped by necessity into something that could perform the sacred work without the burden of empathy or doubt. The corridor they were led down was narrower than the main thoroughfare, but still large enough to accommodate hundreds walking abreast. The walls here were carved with new images, not the faces of saints or sinners, but diagrams, technical schematics that hurt to look at directly, their lines and angles suggesting geometries that human minds were not meant to process. The Chosen caught glimpses of machinery that existed as much in psychic space as physical reality, of conduits designed to channel not electricity, but essence itself. Other attendants joined the procession, their robes rustling in perfect synchronization. Some carried instruments whose purpose was unclear, but whose mere presence filled the air with a subsonic humming that made teeth ache and bones vibrate. Others bore censers that released not incense, but something thicker, more cloying, a smoke that seemed to cling to the inside of the lungs and refuse to be exhaled. The faithful walked in perfect silence now, their earlier whispers and prayers completely stilled. Some wept, but even their tears fell without sound, as if the very air had become too thick to carry such small expressions of grief. The Chosen tried to count their companions, but found their eyes sliding away from individual faces, as if the ability to see others as separate beings was being slowly stripped away. They walked for what might have been hours or days. Time had lost all meaning in this place, where neither sun nor stars could penetrate. The only measure of progress was the gradual change in their surroundings, the slow transformation from carved stone to that organic-looking material, and finally to something that defied classification entirely. The walls seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and the phosphorescent glow had deepened to something that was less light than the absence of darkness. Finally, they arrived at their destination. The chamber that opened before them was so vast that its far walls were lost in shadow despite the unnatural radiance that filled the air. The ceiling, if it existed at all, was invisible beyond layers of drifting smoke and what might have been clouds of luminescent gas. But it was the floor that drew the eye and held it in fascinated horror. Thousands upon thousands of figures knelt in perfect rows, their backs straight and heads bowed in attitudes of prayer or submission. From this distance they looked like an army of penitents, a congregation so vast that their combined prayers might indeed have the power to sustain a god. But as the Chosen was led closer, the truth became apparent. These were not the faithful at prayer. These were the husks. Each figure had once been human, but whatever had made them individual beings was gone. Their faces were slack, empty of expression or recognition. Their eyes stared at nothing, reflecting the chamber's strange light like polished glass. They breathed, but barely. Their hearts beat, but only just enough to keep their bodies from immediate decay. They were alive in the most technical sense, but everything that had made them people had been carefully, surgically removed. The Chosen was guided to an empty space in one of the rows, their legs folding beneath them as if controlled by invisible strings. Around them, the other newly arrived faithful took their positions with the same mechanical precision. The attendants moved among them, making final adjustments to their posture, ensuring perfect alignment in the ranks of the hollowed out. It was then that the true horror of their situation became clear. This was not the site of their sacrifice. This was where they would wait for it. Here in this vast chamber of the empty, they would kneel until their number was called, until the machinery that fed on human souls was ready for their particular essence. Some of those around them might have been waiting for hours. Others might have been waiting for years. Their minds long since departed, while their bodies maintained the pretense of life. The Chosen tried to speak, to scream, to move from their assigned position, but their voice made no sound. Their limbs refused to obey. Their body had become as much a prisoner as their mind. Whatever process had begun in the upper levels was nearing completion. Soon they would be just another empty shell kneeling in perfect formation, waiting for a summons that might never come. But consciousness remained, trapped behind eyes that could no longer blink, locked inside a skull that had become both temple and tomb. The Chosen could see everything, understand everything, feel everything, but could no longer affect anything. They were a passenger in their own flesh, watching helplessly as the final preparations were made. The great ritual began without fanfare or announcement. One moment the chamber was filled with nothing but the soft sound of thousands breathing in unison. The next, the air itself seemed to catch fire. It started as a vibration felt more than heard, heard, a thrumming that seemed to emanate from the bones of Terra itself. The phosphorescent glow that had filled the chamber began to pulse in rhythm with this deep beat, growing brighter and dimmer like the breathing of some colossal entity. The Chosen felt it in their chest, their skull, the spaces between their atoms, a resonance that threatened to shake them apart at the molecular level. Then came the voices. They rose from everywhere and nowhere, a choir of such size and power that individual voices were lost in the overwhelming harmony. But these were not human voices, or at least not entirely human any longer. There were undertones that spoke of vast age and accumulated suffering, overtones that suggested consciousness spread across dimensions that mortal minds could not grasp. The words they sang were in no language ever spoken by living tongues, yet their meaning was burned directly into the listener's understanding. Feed the light that burns eternal. Sustain the world that guards humanity. Let thy essence join the golden fire that holds back the darkness between stars. The ritual had begun.
Massive doors opened in walls that had seemed solid moments before, revealing chambers beyond chambers, stretching away into impossible distances. From these openings came new figures, not the mechanical attendants, but beings that had once been human psychers. Their robes were woven from threads of pure psychic energy, their faces hidden behind masks of crystallized soul stuff that sparkled with the dreams and nightmares of a million minds. These were the harvesters, the sacred instruments through which the Emperor's hunger was fed. Each carried tools that existed as much in the warp as in reality, blades that could cut through the barriers between soul and flesh, conduits that could channel the essence of being into forms that the Golden Throne could consume. They moved with purpose that was both terrible and beautiful, their every gesture part of a ritual that had been perfected over 10 millennia of practice. The Chosen watched in paralyzed fascination as the harvesters began their work. They moved through the ranks of kneeling figures with surgical precision, selecting individuals according to some criteria that remained invisible to mortal perception. Those chosen for immediate harvest showed no sign of recognition or fear. Their minds were already too far gone for such luxuries. When a harvester's blade touched flesh, there was no blood, no wound in any conventional sense. Instead, there was a sound like silk being torn, a sensation of something fundamental being severed at its roots. The victim's body would convulse once, violently, and then fall forward with the finality of a tree whose trunk had been cut through. But it was not death that claimed them. Death would have been merciful. What the Chosen witnessed was something far more profound and terrible. It was the surgical removal of everything that made a human being more than mere meat. The soul, as it was torn away, became visible for just an instant, a writhing mass of memory and emotion, love and fear and hope, all twisted together into something that pulsed with its own inner light. The harvesters captured these liberated essences in their crystalline tools, each soul adding its glow to an accumulating radiance that grew brighter with every harvest. But the bodies did not die. Even after their souls had been torn away, they continued to breathe. Their hearts continued to beat. They had become something less than living, but more than dead. Empty vessels that could still serve the Emperor's purposes in other ways. Attendants gathered these hollow shells, carrying them away to destinations the Chosen could not see, but could imagine all too well. Even soulless, they would find purpose as servitors, as nutrients for the vast biomechanical systems that kept Terra functioning, as raw materials for rituals that required flesh without the complication of consciousness. The harvesters worked their way through the ranks with methodical efficiency. Row by row, soul by soul, they fed the Emperor's endless hunger. The Chosen could do nothing but watch and wait, knowing that their turn would come, that eventually one of those terrible figures would kneel beside them and raise their impossible blade. Hours passed, or perhaps years. Time had lost all meaning in this place where eternity was measured in harvested souls. The Chosen's consciousness began to fragment under the strain of witnessing such systematic obliteration of human essence. They found themselves thinking not of escape or rescue, but of simpler things. The taste of bread from their homeworld, the sound of rain on metal roofing, the feel of sunlight on skin that had never known the touch of Terra's artificial illumination. These memories became more real than the chamber around them, more substantial than their paralyzed flesh. In their fragmenting mind, they were simultaneously kneeling in this hall of harvest and walking through fields of grain beneath an alien sun. They could smell the distinctive sweetness of their homeworld's air, could hear the voices of people whose names they could no longer quite remember, but whose love had shaped the person they used to be. The promises of the Emperor were far away. The fear of death had disappeared. The yearning for love was a memory only. Only the familiar smell and taste were real. It was in this state of fractured awareness that the harvester finally came for them. The figure knelt beside them with movements that suggested infinite practice, infinite repetition of this same sacred act. Up close, the Chosen could see that the mask was not truly crystallized soul stuff, but something even more disturbing. The compressed and purified essence of countless previous harvests, shaped into a tool that could interface directly with the psychic realm. Through its faceted surface, they glimpsed fragmentary images, other faces, other moments of harvest, other souls crying out in the instant of their severance. The blade, when it was raised, was beautiful in a way that transcended mere aesthetics. It was crafted from materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its edge sharp enough to cut through the bonds that held spirit to flesh. Looking at it directly caused the Chosen's vision to blur and fragment, as if their eyes were trying to process an image that contained too much information for mortal perception to handle. But in the moment before the blade descended, something unexpected happened. The Chosen felt a presence, vast, ancient, and terrible beyond description. It was not the Emperor, though it emanated from the direction of the Golden Throne. It was something that had grown around the Emperor over the millennia, fed by the accumulated suffering and sacrifice of countless billions, a psychic entity born from humanity's collective pain and nurtured by 10,000 years of ritualized death. This presence turned its attention to the Chosen for just an instant, and in that moment of contact, they understood the true scope of what they were part of. The harvest was not just about feeding the Emperor's dying flesh. It was about sustaining something far larger and more complex, a psychic ecosystem that had grown to encompass the entire species, a network of suffering and sacrifice that bound every human soul to Terra's golden heart. They saw the truth that the priests would never speak, that the Emperor was no longer truly human, if he had ever been. He was something else now, a god thing sustained by the endless consumption of his own species' spiritual essence. The Golden Throne was not a seat of power, but a feeding mechanism, a vast psychic digestive system that processed human souls into the energy needed to maintain the Emperor's vigil against the chaos of the warp. And they understood, finally, that their sacrifice was not unique or special. It was simply the latest meal in an endless feast that had been going on for millennia and would continue for millennia more. They were fuel, nothing more. Their thoughts, their memories, their capacity for love and hope and dreams, all of it would be consumed to keep the Emperor's corpse body functioning for one more day. The blade fell. There was no pain, not in any physical sense. Instead, there was a sensation of unraveling, of carefully woven patterns being pulled apart thread by thread. The Chosen felt their memories scatter like leaves in a wind, their emotions drain away like water through a broken vessel. Everything that had made them individual, everything that had made them human, was being carefully separated from the basic life force that animated their flesh. They tried to hold on to something, anything that might preserve some small part of who they had been, but the process was too thorough, too complete. The harvest
harvesters had perfected their technique over centuries of practice. Nothing would be wasted, nothing would be allowed to escape the sacred consumption. In their final moment of consciousness, the Chosen felt themselves being drawn away from their body, pulled along currents of psychic energy towards something so vast and hungry that it defied comprehension. They had one last glimpse of the Emperor, not as the golden god of imperial propaganda, but as he truly was, a thing of rotting flesh and burning bone, held together by machinery and will, and the endless sacrifice of his own species, a being so far beyond death that he could no longer remember what life had felt like, sustained by an appetite that had grown to encompass the galaxy itself. The chosen soul screamed as it was consumed, but the scream was lost in the chorus of billions who had gone before. Their essence joined the great psychic fire that burned at Terra's heart, becoming part of the fuel that kept humanity's dying god alive for one more day. And in that moment of obliteration, they finally understood the true horror of their faith. They had not transcended. They had simply been eaten. Their body remained kneeling in perfect formation, breathing slowly and regularly, while their heart continued its steady rhythm. But the person who had once inhabited that flesh was gone forever, consumed as completely as if they had never existed. The attendants would come later to collect this new shell, to add it to the countless others that served the Emperor's will without the burden of consciousness or choice. The harvest continued around the empty vessel that had once housed the Chosen, harvesters moving methodically through the ranks as they had for centuries past and would for centuries to come. The great ritual of consumption rolled on with mechanical precision, feeding the Emperor's endless hunger, one soul at a time. And in the depths of Terra, even deeper than this hall of harvest, other rituals were beginning. New processions were forming. New faithful were being prepared for their sacred destiny. The machinery of sacrifice ground on, without pause, without rest, without mercy. For the Emperor's hunger was eternal, and humanity's capacity for faith was infinite. As long as both endured, the harvest would continue. Soul by soul, life by life, the species would feed their dying god until there was nothing left of them but empty flesh and the echo of ancient prayers. The whispers in darkness between stars spoke truly. There was no salvation to be found on Terra's golden surface, no paradise waiting beyond the veil of death. There was only hunger, vast, patient, and completely without end. And in the silence that followed each soul's consumption, that hunger grew just a little bit stronger, just a little bit more capable of sustaining the rotting corpse of humanity's god for one more day in his endless terrible vigil. The faithful called it sacrifice, the wise called it necessity, but the truth was simpler and more horrifying than either word could encompass. It was just feeding time.